Why avoidants collapse after pushing empaths into silence. And I want to start with the word collapse, because it is the most important word in this title, and the one most likely to be misread, if we don't establish precisely what it means before we build anything on top of it. Collapse does not mean breakdown in the visible, dramatic sense that the word usually implies, not the avoidant falling apart publicly. Not a crisis that announces itself clearly enough that everyone around them can see it happening. Not the kind of obvious disintegration that would be easy to identify and easy to point to as the consequence of what they did. The collapse I am describing is almost entirely interior. It is quiet. It is the kind of collapse that the avoidant themselves may not have adequate language for, may not even consciously recognize as collapse, may experience as something other than what it actually is, as restlessness, as a low-grade dissatisfaction with everything in their current life that they cannot trace back to its source, as an emptiness that the distance they fought so hard to create was supposed to fill and somehow has not. The collapse happens inside the architecture of the avoidant's self-sufficiency, in the private moments when the performance of not needing anyone is temporarily switched off, and what remains in the absence of the performance is something the avoidant was not prepared to find there. And what they find there, in the silence they created by pushing the empath into her own silence, is the specific thing they have spent their entire relational life engineering the perfect conditions to never have to feel. We are going to spend this entire episode inside that specific thing. What it is, why the empath's silence specifically is what finally surfaces it, and why the collapse that follows is simultaneously the most painful and the most significant thing that has ever happened to the avoidance psychology. Because understanding it changes everything. For the empath who is currently in the silence that was pushed upon her, it changes what the silence means and what it is actually doing, not just to her but to the person who pushed her into it. And for anyone who has ever loved an avoidant and wondered whether any of it ever actually cost them anything, this episode is going to answer that question with a specificity and a completeness that nothing else has. Let's start with how we got here, because the moment of the empath's silence does not arrive without history. It arrives at the end of a sequence that has its own internal logic, its own specific emotional arc, its own particular quality of slow accumulation that makes it both inevitable in retrospect and genuinely shocking in the moment. It finally completes itself. The sequence begins, as it almost always does in this specific dynamic, with the empath doing what empaths do, moving toward. Feeling the depth underneath the avoidant surface, the emotional richness that the avoidant's distance is working to conceal, the genuine complexity of a person who has more interior life than they are willing to let anyone access, and responding to that depth with the particular quality of attention and care and patient, persistent presence that is the empath's most natural expression of love. She is not chasing. That framing, the one that positions the empath as a pursuer who should simply stop pursuing, misses something essential about what is actually happening in the early stages of this dynamic. She is responding. Responding to something she can genuinely feel underneath the avoidance presentation. Something real, something that is actually there. Something that the avoidant's own behavior in the windows, when the distance relaxes, confirms, is not a projection or a wishful reading, but an accurate perception of what exists underneath the armor. She responds to it because she can feel it, and feeling something real in someone and not responding to it is not something her nervous system is structured to do easily. So she stays. She is patient. She gives the space that the avoidant signals he needs, and then fills the space when it is offered, and then gives more space when the offering of herself triggers the withdrawal that the avoidance system produces automatically whenever closeness crosses a certain threshold. She does this repeatedly, for longer than she should in most cases, and for reasons that are entirely understandable given the accuracy of what she has always been able to feel underneath the surface she keeps running into. And the avoidant, through all of this, through every cycle of the push and pull, every withdrawal and tentative return, every moment of genuine connection followed by the retreat that the genuine connection triggers, the avoidant is receiving something from the empath's persistent presence that he would never consciously name as receiving, because naming it would require acknowledging a need that the entire architecture of his psychology is organized around not having. He is receiving the particular comfort of being pursued by someone who can see him, not the false self, not the carefully managed presentation of self-sufficiency and emotional independence, and the capability that does not require anyone. The actual him, the one underneath all of that, the one the empath's perception reaches without her trying, and that being seen, even while it is being deflected, even while the system is responding to it with the withdrawal that always arrives when closeness becomes too real. That Being seen is providing something to the avoidant psychology that nothing else in his life provides. It is the closest his actual self ever comes to being genuinely met. And the empath, in her patient persistence, in her willingness to remain present across cycle after cycle of the push and pull, is providing that closeness without catastrophe that the avoidance history has never allowed him to experience. She stays. And the staying, even when it is not enough to produce the genuine reciprocity the empath deserves, is registering in the avoidance system as something significant. As something, though he would never be able to articulate this clearly, that he has organized his distance around protecting himself from needing. And every day she stays, the thing he is protecting himself from needing becomes slightly more present in the background of his experience. Slightly more real, slightly more specifically hers, and therefore slightly more specifically at risk when the distance he maintains eventually, finally, pushes her past the point she is able to continue reaching. Now here is the moment this episode is actually about, and it is a moment that arrives not as a scene, not as a confrontation, not as the dramatic ending that the accumulated history of this dynamic might seem to be building toward. It arrives quietly. It arrives in the specific way that things arrive when someone who has been trying for a very long time simply runs out of the particular energy that the trying requires. The empath goes silent, not as a strategy, not as a deliberate attempt to produce a specific response in the avoidant, though the content about this dynamic will often frame it that way, will often suggest that the empath's silence is a power move, a withdrawal of supply designed to activate the avoidance anxiety and provoke a response that the continuing pursuit never managed to produce. Sometimes there is a small element of that, but primarily fundamentally, in the experience of the empath, who has genuinely reached this point, the silence is not strategic. It is the natural result of a nervous system that has given everything available in a particular direction and has simply finally genuinely run out. The reaching stops. Not because she decided to stop, because there is nothing left to reach with. And in the absence of her reaching, the space between them changes in a way that the avoidant registers immediately before he has consciously noticed that anything is different, in the specific way that any system registers the removal of something it has been organized around managing. The empath's silence lands on the avoidant psychology like nothing the avoidant's previous relational history has produced. And understanding why requires understanding something about the specific function that the empath's pursuit was serving in the avoidant's psychological economy, that the avoidant was not consciously aware it was serving. In attachment theory, avoidant attachment is not the absence of attachment need. It is the suppression of attachment need, the routing of the need underground where it continues to operate and influence behavior, while the conscious experience presents as not having the need at all. The avoidant genuinely experiences himself as not needing closeness, as preferring independence, as finding relationships more draining than sustaining. This is the conscious experience. Underneath it, the attachment need is fully present and fully operational, producing the same biological drive toward connection and the same fear of its absence that every human being carries, but expressing itself only in the indirect, barely perceptible ways that the suppression system allows. And one of the ways it expresses itself, in the specific context of a relationship with an empath, whose pursuit has been consistent and genuine and accurately directed at the actual person rather than the performance, is through the regulatory function that the empath's presence has been quietly providing. The empath's persistence, her continued reaching, her patient staying, her refusal to be fully expelled by the distance, has been functioning as a kind of external regulator for the avoidant's suppressed attachment need. It has been providing, at a safe enough distance that the avoidance system could tolerate it without triggering the full withdrawal response, the reassurance that the need exists in a context where it could, in theory, be met. Not actually met. The avoidance system never allows the actual meeting, but potentially met, held in the background as a possibility, and that possibility, maintained by the empath's consistent presence and consistent reaching, has been doing more work in the avoidance psychology than the avoidant has any conscious awareness of. When the empath goes silent, the possibility collapses, not gradually, with a completeness and an abruptness that the gradual withdrawal would not produce, because the gradual withdrawal is something the avoidance system is accustomed to managing. It is, in a sense, what the system was designed to produce and therefore what it knows how to respond to. The complete silence is different. It is not the distance he created. It is something else entirely, something that his distance was supposed to prevent and has instead finally produced. It is the empath's genuine absence. And genuine absence. Not the presence being held at arm's length, not the closeness being managed from a safe distance, but the actual, complete, No longer reaching absence of the person whose reaching was the specific thing the entire management system was organized around. Genuine absence does something to the avoidant psychology that nothing else in his relational history has done. It surfaces the thing the system was built to suppress. And what that thing is, and what the collapse it produces actually looks like from the inside, and why it is both the most painful thing the avoidant has ever experienced, and the only thing that has ever had the genuine potential to change something fundamental about how he moves through the world. That is exactly where we are going next. What surfaces when the empath goes silent is not what the avoidant expected to find there, and the not expecting is itself important because it reveals something about the depth of the suppression that has been operating throughout the entire dynamic. The avoidant expected relief. This is what the avoidance system promised him the distance would deliver. The relief of not being reached for, not being seen too closely, not having to manage the anxiety that the empath's accurate perception produced every time it got near enough to the actual self to make the construction feel genuinely threatened. The relief was supposed to be the payoff of the distance. The confirmation that the distance was right was necessary was what he actually needed rather than what the system was trained to reach for automatically whenever closeness crossed a threshold the system was not equipped to tolerate. He was supposed to feel better without her reaching. He was supposed to exhale. The quiet was supposed to be the quiet he had always been moving toward. The particular quality of alone that his psychology had always presented to him as the natural state of a person like him, a person who functions better independently, who finds the demands of genuine closeness more exhausting than sustaining, who needs more space than most relationships allow, and who has spent his entire relational life trying to find or create that space without fully being able to maintain it for long enough that the relief became permanent. The relief does not arrive, or it arrives briefly in the first hours or the first day or two, and feels enough like what was promised that the avoidant notes it as confirmation that he was right about the distance. And then something else arrives in its place. Not immediately, not dramatically, but with a consistency and a persistence that the relief does not have, a low, specific, sourceless discomfort that the avoidance system does not have adequate language for and does not immediately recognize as what it is. He does not recognize it as missing her, not at first, because missing someone implies an attachment he has spent his entire life constructing an identity around not having. He recognizes it as something wrong with the current arrangement of his life, something slightly off about the quality of the days without her reaching, something absent from the background of his experience that he cannot quite name, because naming it would require him to identify it as hers, and identifying it as hers would require him to acknowledge that it was there to begin with. So he does what the avoidant always does with things that cannot be named. He moves around the feeling. He gets busy. He goes to the gym more frequently, or throws himself into work with an intensity that his colleagues notice as a change, or fills the hours that her presence previously occupied with activities that generate enough forward momentum that the static underneath them stays, for a while, manageable. It does not stay manageable. And the specific reason it does not stay manageable is the thing that distinguishes the empath's silence from every other absence the avoidant has engineered or experienced in his relational history. Every previous absence has been the avoidant's own creation. The distance he chose, the withdrawal he initiated, the ending he engineered when closeness became intolerable. Those absences came with the particular quality of agency that makes absence bearable for the avoidant, because agency is the thing that transforms frightening experiences into survivable ones in his psychological framework. If he chose the distance is not abandonment. If he created the ending is not rejection. If he withdrew before being left, the loss is not the specific kind of loss that the avoidance system was built to defend against. The original loss, the foundational one, the one that taught the nervous system in the first place that closeness and loss were essentially the same package delivered at different times. The empath's silence does not come with that quality of agency. He did not choose her silence. He pushed her into it, which is not the same thing, because pushing someone into silence and choosing silence yourself are experiences that land on the nervous system in completely different ways. Her silence is not something he can claim as a preference. It is something he produced by being who he is in relationship to who she is, and the production of it and the loss of it are therefore not experiences he can organize around the narrative of having wanted this. He did not want this. He wanted the distance without the absence. He wanted the space without the loss. He wanted her reaching to continue at the precise distance from which he could receive the regulatory benefit of it without being close enough to trigger the full withdrawal response. He wanted the impossible thing that the avoidant always wants. The warmth without the vulnerability, the connection without the risk, the specific comfort of being seen without the terrifying exposure of being fully known. And the empath's silence is the specific consequence of that wanting being finally, completely, and without possibility of deniable revision, impossible to sustain. This is where the collapse begins in earnest. Not in the first week, when the business can still manage the static. Not in the second week, when the management starts requiring more effort, but is still possible. Somewhere in the third or fourth week, or sometimes earlier depending on the depth of the dynamic and the length of the empath's previous reaching. Something in the avoidant psychology stops being manageable through the usual means. The static becomes noise. The absence becomes specific in a way that general business cannot address, because it is not general. It is the absence of one particular person's one particular quality of perception, and no amount of forward momentum produces a substitute for something that's specific. The avoidant starts remembering things with a clarity that feels almost involuntary, the specific texture of her attention, the particular quality of being in the presence of someone who understood what he was saying before he finished saying it. The way she stayed through the cycles of his withdrawal, without making the staying into something he owed her, without using her persistence as leverage, without converting her patience into a claim on his vulnerability that the vulnerability was not prepared to honor. He did not appreciate any of that while it was happening. The avoidance system is not designed to appreciate things while they are happening. It is designed to manage them while they are happening and assess them only when they are gone, and now they are gone. And the assessment is arriving with a completeness and a specificity that nothing in the avoidance usual toolkit is adequate to address, because the toolkit was built for managing closeness, and the thing it is being asked to manage is absence. And absence, for a nervous system organized around the suppression of attachment need, is the one experience the system has no genuine defense against. Because the defenses were built to protect against the risks of closeness. Nobody defended against the loss of it. Nobody thought the loss would be the thing that finally broke through. What the collapse produces, in the avoidant who goes through it fully rather than immediately reaching for a replacement that short-circuits the process, is a confrontation with the suppressed attachment need that is unlike anything he has consciously experienced before. Because the need is no longer suppressed. The empath's absence has removed the conditions under which the suppression was working. The conditions being the availability of something to suppress the need against. The presence of someone whose reaching could be deflected and thereby confirm the narrative of not needing. With nothing to deflect, the need surfaces not as a desire for her specifically, not initially, but as a formless, urgent, uncomfortable aliveness in a part of his interior that has been quiet for so long that the aliveness feels almost foreign. Like a limb that has been asleep for years suddenly being asked to bear weight. The process of its surfacing is painful in a way that is difficult to sit inside without immediately reaching for something to manage it with. And the reaching he typically does is toward her. The message arrives. The call comes. The mutual friend suddenly has a question that requires him to reach out in a way that seems too deliberate to be casual to anyone paying attention. The hoovering that attachment theorists have described in avoidant attachment begins not because of calculation, but because the surface need is driving behavior that the conscious mind is simultaneously rationalizing as something other than what it is. And here is what the empath, sitting in her silence, needs to understand about this moment, the moment the avoidant reaches back. Because this moment is the most dangerous and the most misread moment in the entire dynamic, and how she responds to it will determine whether what follows is a genuine change in the architecture of the relationship or a return to the cycle at a slightly later point in its rotation. The avoidant reaching back is not the same as the avoidant having changed. The need that is driving the reach is real. The discomfort that produced it is genuine. The collapse that preceded it was significant in ways that the avoidant himself may not yet fully understand or be able to articulate. All of that is true. But the collapse and the reach are the beginning of a reckoning that has not yet been completed, not even close to completed, and completing it requires something from the avoidant that the reach, on its own, does not indicate he has developed the capacity for. It requires the willingness to let the reckoning complete itself, rather than short-circuiting it by restoring the regulatory function the empath was providing before the silence began. Because if the empath responds to the reach by returning to the previous arrangement, by allowing her presence to restore the avoidance system to its pre-collapse equilibrium without that equilibrium having genuinely restructured by what the collapse revealed, the collapse will have done its most important work in the dark. Without producing the change it was the only thing capable of producing. The empath who understands this is not the empath who plays games with her response. She is not weaponizing her silence or calculating the optimal moment to re-engage for maximum leverage. She is simply the empath who finally, in the stillness that her own exhaustion created, found the ground of herself again, who remembered what it feels like to exist without orienting everything toward someone else's management of closeness, who discovered, in the quiet she did not originally choose, something she had not fully had access to while the reaching was consuming everything, her own clarity about what she actually needs from a relationship, what genuine reciprocity actually feels like versus what she had been accepting as a substitute for it, what she is and is not willing to return to even if the returning is offered the option. That clarity sitting quietly in the empath, who has been in her silence long enough to find it, is the only thing that makes what comes next genuinely different from what came before. Not the avoidance collapse as real as it is, not the avoidance reach as genuine as the need behind it may be, the empath's clarity, because the dynamic between an avoidant and an empath is always, finally, determined not by what the avoidant is willing to do when the cost of his patterns becomes undeniable, but by what the empath is willing to accept when the reaching starts again. And that determination, made from a place of genuine self-knowledge and genuine self-regard rather than from the exhaustion and the hope in the accurate perception of what is real underneath the construction that produced every previous response.